Before we begin, take a moment to breathe in the silence of history, because what you are about to hear is not the polished tale of fairy tale royalty. It is not about the sparkling gowns, the waving crowds, or the smiles frozen in photographs. A story buried in blood, shadow, and memory. If you are drawn to the forgotten truths that linger in the corners of history, stay with us. And remember to subscribe, so you won't miss the next journey into the darkness of the past. For millions, her name belongs to the late 20th century, to a woman whose life seemed torn between elegance and tragedy. But Diana did not simply appear out of nowhere. She carried with her the weight of a lineage that stretched back centuries. A bloodline marked by betrayal, ambition, and the brutal legacy of the Tudors. It is easy to think of Diana as the people's princess, but long before she became the most photographed woman in the world, her ancestry was already tangled in the darker threads of English history, because to understand Diana fully, you must first look backwards, into the age of kings and queens who carved their legacies not in kindness, but in blood. The Tudors. They ruled England from the late 15th century into the early 17th, and their story was anything but graceful. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, claimed his throne in 1485 after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. It was the end of the Wars of the Roses, but it was also the beginning of something darker. Henry VII's reign rested on fragile legitimacy. To strengthen his dynasty, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting two rival houses. Yet the Tudors would forever carry suspicion, always looking over their shoulders, always fearful of rivals who might rise from the shadows. And it was in this crucible of fear that the bloody Tudor legacy began, a legacy that centuries later would touch. Known for his 6 wives, his break with the Catholic Church, and his endless hunger for power. But Henry was more than just a man with a taste for grandeur. He was a monarch who weaponized loyalty and punished betrayal without hesitation. His court was a place of whispers, and at the stroke of a pen, noble bloodlines were extinguished. Heads rolled, not because of crimes proven, but because of the suspicions of a single man sitting on a throne. Henry's reign carved fear deep into the veins of England, and the shadow of that reign never truly faded. Passed to his children. Edward VI, frail and young, ruled only briefly. Then Mary I, remembered as Bloody Mary, whose attempt to restore Catholicism saw hundreds burned at the stake. And finally, Elizabeth II, the Virgin Queen, whose long reign brought stability, but at the cost of endless plots, executions, and conspiracies. These rulers lived in a constant cycle of fear and survival, and within this world, noble families either rose into favor or were crushed into silence. But their bloodlines lived on. And those same bloodlines, over centuries, wound their way into the veins of Diana Spencer. The Spencer family, Diana's ancestors, rose in prominence during these turbulent times. They were not monarchs, but they were close enough to power to feel both its warmth and its danger. Generation after generation, the Spencers wove themselves into the fabric of England's aristocracy. They married into influential houses. They gained wealth, but they also carried the memories of a kingdom scarred by Tudor violence. Imagine the halls of Althorpe, the ancestral home of the Spencers. Imagine the portraits on the walls, noble men and women who lived through the storm of Tudor politics, each face a reminder that proximity to the throne was both a blessing and a curse. By the time Diana was born in 1961, the Tudors were long gone, but their legacy lingered in every drop of aristocratic blood. Because ancestry is more than names written on parchment. A chain that links the living to the dead across centuries of war, betrayal, and ambition. She was not just a young woman who happened to marry into royalty. She was the product of centuries of survival, of noble houses who had endured under monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth II. The bloody Tudor legacy still whispered through her veins. When Diana entered the public eye, many saw her as a fresh beginning, a breath of innocence in a monarchy weighed down by formality. And for Diana, those shadows stretched back to the Tudors. She was adored by the people in a way few royals had ever been. She represented compassion, warmth, and humanity. And yet, within her very ancestry was the imprint of a dynasty remembered for cruelty, control, and suspicion. The Tudors thrived on fear. Diana, centuries later, lived and died under the crushing weight of media scrutiny, different weapons. Perhaps that is why Diana's story feels so haunting. It was the echo of countless stories before her, and noble families who learned that survival required silence, strategy, and sacrifice. The Tudors may have vanished into the pages of history, but their legacy was not erased. It lived on, not just in the throne itself, but in the blood of those who circled around it, in the lineage of families like the Spencers, and ultimately, in Diana herself. So when you think of Princess Diana, do not only picture the glamour of the 1980s, do not only recall the fairy tale wedding or the tragic crash in Paris. Think also of the shadows she carried. Shadows born centuries before her. Shadows painted in Tudor blood, because history does not disappear. It waits. It lingers in the silence of old houses, in the faded ink of family trees, in the stories whispered from one generation to the next. And sometimes it emerges in a single person, a person who embodies both the light and the darkness of a dynasty. Princess Diana was such a person. The Tudors are long gone, but their bloody legacy lived on in her, shaping not only her ancestry, but the way the world remembers her. If you found this story haunting, there is more. Much more. The past is filled with shadows waiting to be uncovered. So, if you want to walk further into that darkness, subscribe. Join us for the next chapter, because history never truly sleeps. The deeper we walk into Diana's ancestry, the more we uncover how the Tudors shaped not only the monarchy, but the families who served it. And in that shadow, we begin to see how the echoes of the past can stretch forward, centuries beyond their own time. This is not a comfortable story, because while the Tudors are remembered in schoolbooks for their glittering courts and iconic monarchs, their true legacy is one of suspicion, betrayal, and manipulation. And those legacies did not die with them. They lived on in the noble families who tied themselves to the throne. To understand Diana's lineage, you must understand the game of survival played by English nobility. For those close to the crown, life was never secure. A gesture of friendship could be a prelude to betrayal. But they also ruled with fear. Survival became an art form. They grew wealthy through trade in wool, the lifeblood of Tudor England. This wealth allowed them to rise from merchants into nobility. And once they entered the orbit of the court, they never left. Because under the Tudors, success was dangerous. Imagine being a noble in Henry VIII's court. The next, a rumour whispers your name, and before the week ends, your head lies on the block. And that was the world the Spencers learned to navigate. By Elizabeth I's reign, the Spencers had become firmly established among England's most influential families. They owned vast estates, with Althorp standing as a monument to their power. But beneath the polished image of stability, the lessons of Tudor terror still lingered, because every family that survived the Tudors carried scars. They carried the memory that loyalty was fragile, that favour could vanish overnight, and that the only way to endure was to remain useful. Generation after generation, this knowledge was passed down silently, like an heirloom no one dared to speak of. It became part of the very identity of the family, and centuries later, Diana inherited not only the name Spencer, but also the weight of this unspoken history. But ancestry is more than politics. And Diana's blood carried the echoes of royal lineage as well. Her family tree connected to the Stuarts, the Tudors, and other dynasties whose lives were shaped by ambition and conflict. Consider this. Diana and Prince Charles were distant cousins, both descendants of Henry VII. Their marriage, presented as a fairy tale union, was in fact a reunion of bloodlines split centuries earlier. The Tudors had once ruled by uniting rival houses, and here again history seemed to fold back on itself, a legacy of union, but also of tragedy. The Tudors, for all their power, lived haunted lives. Henry VIII could not escape the shadow of succession. Mary I ruled in constant fear of conspiracies. Elizabeth. I never married, knowing that any husband might become her master or her executioner. And centuries later, Diana too found herself trapped in a legacy of control. Her life became a performance. Every gesture, every glance, every word was dissected. She was adored, yes, but she was also scrutinized. A modern queen of hearts, yet bound by the same invisible chains that had shackled women of the Tudor court. Consider Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. She rose from obscurity to the highest throne in England, but once her charm waned, she was destroyed. Her downfall was not just political, it was personal. Her very body became the site of her punishment. Now compare that to Diana. She too rose swiftly, adored by millions across the world. Yet when her marriage fractured, when she no longer fit the image demanded by the crown, she too was cast aside, not with an axe on a scaffold, but with isolation, rejection, and the merciless eye of the media. Different centuries, different instruments, but the same story. This is what makes Diana's ancestry so haunting, because her fate mirrored those who came before her. The Tudors left behind a legacy of fear, control, and sacrifice. And though Diana lived in the modern world, she was still ensnared by that same legacy. History has a way of repeating itself, not in exact detail, but in echo. The bloodline of the Tudors did not only shape kings and queens of the past. It shaped the destiny of one of the most beloved figures of the 20th century. And perhaps this is why Diana's story still captivates us. Because it is not simply her own, it is a continuation. A thread spun long before her birth, woven by ancestors who navigated the dangerous courts of Tudor kings and queens. Her tragedy was not random. It was history, repeating itself in a modern age. As we peel back the layers of Diana's ancestry, one truth becomes clear. The Tudors never truly died. Their dynasty may have ended, but their shadow remained, stretching through time, through family lines, through the very blood of those who came after. Princess Diana was not just a victim of modern royalty. She was the inheritor of centuries of struggle, ambition, and sacrifice. A legacy written in Tudor blood. If you have followed this far, you know there is more to uncover. The story does not end here, because every noble family, every royal house, carries secrets buried just beneath the surface, and Diana's is no exception. So, stay with us, subscribe if you haven't already, because in the next chapter we will journey even deeper into the shadows of her ancestry and discover just how dark the legacy truly is. Because history always finds a way to return. History does not sleep, it lingers. And when we look at Diana's ancestry, we see that the shadow of the Tudors was not only political, it was deeply personal. Because the Tudor legacy was written not only in wars and treaties, but in the lives and deaths of the women who bore their name. And in their fates, we can see reflections of Diana's own. The Tudor dynasty was notorious for its treatment of women. Queens, mistresses, and daughters were not seen as individuals, but as pawns in a game of power. Their value was measured by what they could bring: a political alliance, an heir, or a temporary distraction from the king's restlessness. And when they failed, they were cast aside. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey. Women who once stood in the center of power, only to be destroyed when their usefulness ended. This was the bloody rhythm of the Tudor court. A cycle of rise and fall, of love turned into weapon, of loyalty punished with death. And centuries later, Diana found herself caught in a similar rhythm, not with scaffolds and swords, but with headlines and flashbulbs. Yet the result was the same: a woman adored, then abandoned. To see this pattern clearly, consider Anne Boleyn. She was clever, ambitious, and dazzling in her ability to hold Henry VIII's attention. But when she failed to give him a male heir, her position crumbled. Accused of treason and adultery, she was executed in 1536. Her rise had been meteoric, her fall catastrophic. Now think of Diana. She too captured attention instantly. The world adored her, the monarchy relied on her, and she seemed to embody a new era of hope. But when her marriage fractured, when she no longer fit the role assigned to her, the knives came out. Not literal knives, but the sharp edge of media and monarchy. Different centuries, different instruments. But the echo is undeniable. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, suffered a similar fate. Barely more than a teenager when she married the king, she was accused of infidelity and executed just 2 years later. Her downfall was swift, her youth offering no protection. She was a reminder that in the Tudor court, innocence was irrelevant. The crown demanded obedience, and any hint of betrayal, real or imagined, was punished with death. Diana, too, was young when she entered the royal family. Just 19 when she married Charles, she was thrust into a world she could not control. Like Catherine, she was expected to adapt, to play a role written for her long before her arrival. And when she showed independence, when she stepped outside of expectation, she was met not with compassion, but with condemnation. And then there was Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. A pawn in the ambitions of others, she ruled for little more than a week before being deposed and executed. Her short, tragic reign was never truly her own. She was a victim of forces larger than herself. Is this not also Diana's story? For though she was never queen, she became something even greater, a symbol. Her life, like Jane's, was not fully her own. It was shaped by the expectations of monarchy, the gaze of the public, and the manipulation of those around her. Her voice, her choices, were often drowned out by the weight of history pressing down upon her. This is the pattern we see when we trace Diana's ancestry back to the Tudors. It is not simply the story of kings and battles. It is the story of women caught in a system that demanded perfection, obedience, and sacrifice, while offering little in return. The Tudor legacy was not just bloody, it was suffocating. It created a world in which women were celebrated only when they served a purpose, and forgotten when they no longer did. And Diana, centuries later, inherited not only the blood of these women, but their fate. It is easy to romanticize the Tudors today, the glittering courts, the grand banquets, the dazzling gowns. But beneath that surface, the reality was far more chilling. The Tudor world was one of fear. Every laugh at a banquet could hide suspicion. Every toast could be followed by betrayal. Every step closer to the throne was a step closer to destruction. And this is the shadow Diana was born into. She may have lived in the modern age, but the monarchy she entered was still burdened by centuries of expectation, secrecy, and tradition. The same structures that destroyed Anne, Catherine, and Jane still lingered, invisible but powerful. Think of the symbolism. Anne Boleyn, destroyed for failing to fit the role demanded of her. Catherine Howard, punished for her youth and vulnerability. Lady Jane Grey, sacrificed for a political game she did not choose. And then Diana, a woman adored across the world, yet trapped in a marriage that suffocated her and ultimately crushed by the weight of scrutiny. Her tragedy was not new, it was ancient, an echo of stories written long before her birth. So when we say that Diana carried the legacy of the Tudors, we mean more than genealogy. We mean that she inherited their shadows, the patterns of rise and fall, of glory and destruction, the cycle of women raised to impossible heights, then cast down when they could not conform. And that is why her story feels so haunting, because it does not stand alone. It is part of a chain that stretches back to the bloody courts of the Tudors, a chain forged in fear, betrayal, and ambition, a chain that has bound women for centuries. Diana's ancestry reminds us of one truth: history never truly ends, it only transforms. The Tudors may have ruled with executions and prisons, the modern monarchy ruled with silence and pressure, but both demanded the same thing: control, and both destroyed those who resisted it. If you are beginning to see the echoes, then you know there is more to uncover, because Diana's lineage does not stop with the Tudors. It stretches even further, into dynasties whose shadows still linger over Europe, whose decisions still ripple through the present. So, stay with us, and remember to subscribe so you do not miss what lies ahead. Because the deeper we go into Diana's ancestry, the darker the truth becomes, and history is never finished. When we look at Diana's ancestry, it is tempting to stop with the Tudors. After all, their story is dramatic enough, filled with betrayal, ambition, and blood. But Diana's lineage stretches further, beyond the Tudors, beyond even the English throne, into a web of European dynasties, each carrying their own shadows. Because Diana was not just an English aristocrat, she was the descendant of kings and queens across the continent, and each of them left behind a legacy that shaped not only her ancestry, but her destiny. Let us begin with the Stuarts, the dynasty that followed the Tudors. Their reign was no less turbulent, marked by civil war, regicide, and exile. The Stuarts inherited the throne after Elizabeth's death in 1603, but their rule quickly descended into chaos. James I, the first Stuart king of England, believed in the divine right of kings. To him, monarchs answered only to God, not to their subjects. This belief set the stage for conflict. His son, Charles I, clung to the same idea. But the people of England had grown tired of kings who ruled without restraint. The result, a civil war, and in 1649, Charles I was executed, his head severed before a horrified crowd. It was the first time an English monarch had been publicly tried and killed by his own people. The monarchy itself trembled on the edge of extinction. Now consider what this means for Diana's bloodline. She was descended from this same family, a family that had learned brutally that power was fragile, that even a crown could be stripped away, that loyalty from subjects could dissolve into rebellion. Is it any wonder, then, that Diana's story feels heavy with inevitability? Because her ancestry carried not only Tudor blood, but Stuart blood, marked by conflict, tragedy, and downfall. The Stuarts remind us that royalty is never invincible, and Diana, centuries later, would prove the same. But Diana's lineage does not stop there. It spreads outward, into the royal houses of Europe. Through marriages carefully arranged for power, not love, her ancestors connected with dynasties in France, Spain, and beyond. Think of it as a great tapestry. Each thread represents a life, a choice, a sacrifice, and woven together they create the bloodline that eventually produced Diana. But this tapestry is not beautiful. It is torn, stained with betrayal, darkened by ambition. Consider the Bourbons of France. One branch of Diana's ancestry linked her to this doomed dynasty. Think of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, executed during the French Revolution. They too were symbols of glamour, only to be devoured by a world that turned against them. Their story is eerily similar to Diana's, adored in one moment, destroyed in the next. The echo is unmistakable, because whether in Paris in 1793 or in Paris in 1997, Royalty was never safe from public judgment. The guillotine and the flashing camera were different tools, but both demanded sacrifice. Even further back, Diana's ancestry touched the Plantagenets, a dynasty remembered for fierce ambition and endless war. The Plantagenets gave England rulers like Richard the Lionheart and King John, whose reign led to the Magna Carta. They were bold, ruthless, and often destructive. It is this long chain of rulers, Tudors, Stuarts, Bourbons, Plantagenets, that formed Diana's heritage, a chain filled with power and tragedy, triumph and downfall, a chain that carried centuries of blood into the modern age. And yet Diana herself was not crowned. She was not a monarch. She was a princess by marriage, not by birthright. But in the eyes of the people, she embodied something greater. She carried the aura of history, the weight of centuries, and perhaps the inevitability of tragedy. Because in her life, we can see the echoes of all these dynasties, the Tudors, who destroyed their wives when they no longer served, the Stuarts, who lost their crown when they overreached, the Bourbons, who became victims of public fury, the Plantagenets, who fought endlessly for power. Diana was not their equal. She was their heir, and her story was a continuation of theirs. This is what makes her ancestry so haunting. It is not just about noble names on a family tree. It is about patterns, cycles of power and destruction, echoes that repeat across time, reshaping themselves in each new generation. The Tudors ruled with fear, the Stuarts with arrogance, the Bourbons with extravagance, and all paid the price. Diana lived in a world of television cameras and tabloids, not swords and battlefields. But the pattern remained the same. She rose, she was adored, she was scrutinized, and she was destroyed. Think of it this way. History is like a mirror. Each dynasty looks into it, seeing only their reflection, never realizing that behind them stands another figure, waiting to repeat their mistakes. The Tudors looked into it and saw glory, but found blood. The Stuarts saw power, but found rebellion. The Bourbons saw elegance, but found the guillotine. And Diana? She looked into that mirror and saw a fairy tale. But what she found was the echo of centuries. Perhaps that is why her story still grips us today, because it feels both modern and ancient. We see her photographed in glamorous gowns, walking through crowds of adoration, but behind her smile we sense something older, the same shadow that haunted Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, the same shadow that fell over Charles I and Marie Antoinette. Diana was not just a woman of the 20th century, she was the latest chapter in a story that began long before her. A story written in crowns, betrayals, and bloodlines. So when we say Princess Diana's dark ancestry, we mean exactly that. Her story cannot be understood without the weight of the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Bourbons, and more. Her tragedy was not isolated, it was inherited, and that is what makes her legacy so powerful. Because even in death, she stands as the bridge between past and present, the final echo of dynasties that thought themselves immortal. If you are still with us, you can feel it too. The past pressing against the present, the voices of kings and queens whispering through the centuries, and the truth that Diana's story was never just hers. So if you want to keep walking into these shadows, subscribe. Because the story is not over, and the past has more secrets waiting to be uncovered. History does not die, it waits, and Diana's ancestry proves it. The story of Diana's ancestry is not simply about names in a family tree, it is about echoes, echoes that resound across centuries. Because when you trace her lineage back through time, you do not only find kings and queens, you find patterns. And those patterns reveal why her story feels so familiar and so haunting. One of those patterns is sacrifice. Over and over, royal women were sacrificed for the survival of dynasties. Anne Boleyn, sacrificed to secure Henry VIII's freedom. Catherine Howard, sacrificed for rumors of betrayal. Lady Jane Grey, sacrificed for a political scheme that failed. And centuries later, Diana too was sacrificed, not with a blade, but with relentless scrutiny and the crushing weight of expectation. It is almost as if her life had already been written, long before she was born, because the blood she carried was heavy with tragedy, and history has a way of repeating itself. Another pattern is isolation. The Tudors ruled through fear, and fear isolates. Queens like Catherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves were cast aside, left to live in loneliness after being discarded by Henry VIII. Elizabeth I, though powerful, remained alone, sacrificing marriage and love to preserve her throne. Diana, too, lived in isolation. Even as the world adored her, she was often alone in her struggles. The palaces may have been grand, but the walls echoed with silence. The cameras may have followed her, but the flashbulbs could not comfort her. Her isolation was not unique. It was the continuation of a pattern that had haunted her ancestors for centuries. And then there is the final pattern, tragedy. Because in almost every royal house, in every dynasty Diana was connected to, tragedy loomed. The Tudors lost heirs, wives, and allies to the axe. The Stuarts lost their throne, their crown, and even their king's head. The Bourbons lost their lives in the fury of revolution. The Plantagenets lost themselves in endless wars for power. Diana's own life ended in tragedy, echoing this long line of loss. Her death shocked the world, just as the deaths of monarchs had shocked their subjects centuries before. The stage had changed, from scaffold to highway, from axe to automobile. But the story was the same. Royalty and tragedy bound together. This is why Diana's ancestry matters. Because it reminds us that her story was not simply the product of chance, it was part of something larger, a centuries-long narrative of power, sacrifice, isolation, and loss. When we look back at her life, we see not only Diana, but the countless lives that came before her, the women who were silenced, the men who were destroyed, the dynasties that rose, shone, and fell into ruin. Diana was not the first. She was the last echo of a chain that began with the Tudors and stretched across Europe. Think of it this way. History is not a series of separate events. It is a river, and Diana's life was a ripple in that river, shaped by every current that came before. The Tudors carved one current, the Stuarts another, the Bourbons yet another, and all of these currents met in her. It is why her story feels larger than life, because it was never only hers. It belonged to centuries of history flowing through her veins. And yet, Diana changed the pattern, because while so many women before her were silenced, Diana found her voice. She spoke openly about her struggles. She defied the expectations of silence. She revealed the truth about her marriage, her isolation, and her pain. In doing so, she broke with centuries of tradition. She refused to be only a pawn in a royal game. And though this defiance came at a cost, it is also why she remains unforgettable. Diana may have carried the bloody legacy of the Tudors, the Stuarts, and the Bourbons, but she also transformed it. She turned tragedy into compassion. She turned scrutiny into advocacy. She turned the weight of history into a legacy of her own. That is why, even today, her memory endures, because she was not just a princess, she was a mirror that reflected the darkness of history, but also revealed something new, the possibility of breaking the cycle. The Tudors left blood, the Stuarts left rebellion, the Bourbons left destruction, but Diana left something different. She left love, compassion, and a reminder that even in the darkest legacies, light can emerge. And so, when you think of Princess Diana, do not only remember the tragedy, remember the ancestry, remember the centuries that shaped her life, the kings and queens whose mistakes she inherited, the dynasties whose shadows followed her, the bloody Tudor legacy that lingered in her veins. Because in the end, Diana's story was not just about her. It was about history itself, alive, unbroken, and echoing through her life. And now it echoes through us, through the way we remember her, through the lessons we carry from her story, through the awareness that history is never just past, it is present. Princess Diana's dark ancestry was not a burden she chose. It was a destiny she inherited. And though it ended in tragedy, her life remains a testament to the power of resilience, a final chapter in a saga written long ago in the blood of the Tudors. If you have stayed with us until now, you know how deep these shadows run. And there is more, always more. Because history never truly ends. It waits, it watches, and it returns in ways we least expect. So if you want to continue walking into the forgotten corners of the past, subscribe. Because the stories left to tell are darker than you can imagine, and together we will unbury them.